You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. My guest today is Rod Dreher, who is an author, blogger, and senior editor at The American Conservative. He has written several books, including How Dante Can Save Your Life, The Benedict Option, and the recently released Live Not by Lies, which is the topic of our discussion today. Rod, welcome to Talking Freely.
It's great to be here, Rowan.
Many people know you through your bestseller, The Benedict Option, which was subtitled A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. How would you describe Live Not by Lies as complementing this strategy for the church?
Well, that's a great question. Some people have said to me that this does seem like a sequel, Live Not by Lies. And I think the connection is that in Benedict Option, I talked about what it's like to live in a culture that is not only post-Christian, but increasingly hostile to Christian thought and Christian practice. But Live Not by Lies is, I guess you could say, it's a ramping up of the message. In Live Not by Lies, I talk about what happens when you are particularly persecuted, not only for your Christian beliefs, but perhaps even for your political beliefs, as we're seeing happen in both the United States and Australia and some European countries where so-called wokeness is on the ascendancy. And in Live Not by Lies, I write it once again, as a Christian for Christians, and I'm trying to help Christians understand the dispositions that we need to develop and the networks that we need to build in order to prepare not only for a society in which people don't agree with us or don't share our faith, but one in which they actually try to punish us quite severely for holding that faith.
Your book makes careful distinctions between authoritarian dictatorships and totalitarianism. You quote a former Soviet citizen who says that dictatorships can make life hard for you, but totalitarian regimes are seeking our souls. How is it that totalitarian conditions are able to reach into our inner lives and put our souls in peril?
That's a great question. Totalitarianism is a form of authoritarianism, but the classic authoritarian only wants to control the political sphere. They don't really care what you do in your private life or what you think, as long as you obey politically. The totalitarian, though, is an authoritarian, but they go much further. They not only want to control the political sphere, but they want to politicize every aspect of life. This happened to me just this week. It's really rather traumatic, if I'm honest. I wrote a letter to the editor of my local newspaper here in South Louisiana, where I live, praising one of our U.S. senators for voting to impeach Donald Trump. I mean, he's a conservative, I'm a conservative, and I said in my letter that President Trump did some good things, but I think he went too far with the way he behaved on January 6th when the Capitol was invaded. Well, I got a text that morning from a very liberal friend of mine in the state who said, I read your letter to the editor and we can no longer be friends. I said, what do you mean? I wrote in support of impeachment. And she said, yes, but you said Trump did some good things. And I'm still reeling for that. We've been friends for 40 years, 4 decades of a friendship, and she threw it away because I didn't hate President Trump with sufficient purity, I suppose. This is a very personal example for me, Rowan, but it is an example of how politics comes to infest every aspect of our lives. And we're seeing that happen here in the U.S. Constantly. People are always expecting you to make a declaration of some sort or another that you are woke, that you stand on the side, you're an ally of LGBT or Black Lives Matter or whatever the cause du jour is. And they won't leave you alone. Your silence is no longer enough to protect you. You must affirm. And this is totalitarian, frankly. And this is the sort of thing that the people in this country who grew up under communism are now saying that the things we're seeing happen in the US today and in other Western countries, it reminds us of what they left behind.
When we think of that word communism, it conjures up images of might and coercion. But why do you think that we need to open our eyes to truths beyond these common notions?
Yeah, a lot of people, when you hear the word totalitarianism, you think of the Cold War, you think of the gulags, you think of those parades that the Soviet army did on Red Square. And those are all true. That really happened, and that was totalitarianism. I don't think, though, that we're in for Stalinism 2.0 here in our countries. I think rather that the totalitarianism will be less like Orwell, in which the state in 1984 used fear, pain, and terror to force people to comply. And we will rather be more like the totalitarianism in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in which the state got people to comply by manipulating their desire for pleasure and entertainment. I think if you look at something like the Chinese social credit system, that provides a blueprint for what I fear is going to be coming our way. In China, they proved that you can have a political authoritarianism and even totalitarianism while still having a free market society, and you can grow quite rich that way. But they have in China this social credit system, which your listeners probably are aware of since you're in Australia, but in case not, very briefly, it's where the Chinese state consumes a massive amount of data on each individual Chinese citizen, from their cell phone use, to the things they buy, their internet use, where they go on the street, and are captured by closed circuit TV cameras. And they provide each Chinese citizen with a social credit rating. And this is a score that tells you how trustworthy you are, how conformist you are, according to the Communist Party's standards. So if you do things like download the speeches of Xi Jinping, or do things that are considered socially beneficial, you'll get a higher rating, and that opens the doors for you to travel, to your kids get to go to the best schools, you get to eat at the best restaurants, and so forth. But if you do things that are consonant with dissent or with nonconformity, you'll get a lower score. Your score can be so low that you can't buy or sell within the system. Now, this is a brilliant way of controlling the population, because they don't have to send the secret police around to bang on your door if they suspect that you're a dissident. They know where you've been. They know what you've been reading. They know who you've been talking to. And the algorithm itself makes adjustments within the electronic system that connects everybody to reward or punish you based on your behavior online. I think that this is one of the things I mean by soft totalitarianism. They don't have to arrest you or torture you or threaten to throw you in prison to get you to conform. They can just cancel you. They can make it difficult or even impossible for you to get a good job because you are a thought criminal. And this is the sort of thing that I tell my own children. My oldest is in college now, and the others are teenagers. I say, do not put anything on social media that you don't want to be there forever, because it will be forever. And when you get ready to apply for jobs, they will search your social media profile. And if you say things that are controversial, that could cost you a job. That's what I mean by soft totalitarianism. And that's why people need to wake up and to stop thinking about it according to the Orwell model, and to update that to include the Huxley model and the Chinese model. Just before we came on, Rowan, I was reading how Amazon.com, which controls 83% of the United States book market, they have very quietly started removing titles from their electronic shelves, so to speak, titles that they consider to be hate speech. A very prominent one was taken off, or it was revealed that it was taken off earlier this week. A book by a public intellectual named Brian T. Anderson. He's a leading public intellectual. He's a Catholic and the head of the Ethics and Public Policy Center think tank in Washington. He wrote a book 2 years ago critical of transgenderism. Now, Ryan is a serious man. He's Princeton educated, PhD. He he's well credentialed, and his book is filled with solid analysis and medical facts. That wasn't good enough for Amazon. On Amazon today, you can buy Hitler's Mein Kampf, but you can't buy Ryan Anderson's book criticizing transgender ideology. This is so important, not only because it means Ryan Anderson's book is not available for purchase, but more so because Amazon controls so much of the book market in the United States, at least, that if it refuses to sell books that take the point of view of Ryan Anderson's book, then they won't get published, because publishers can't afford to take a chance on an author whose titles Amazon won't carry. And it's not enough to say, oh, you can go to another book retailer to buy it, because Amazon is the 800-pound gorilla in book retailing. This is the kind of thing that, whether it's in books or media or any other kind of retailing or media that provide access to the marketplace, as social media does, as Facebook does, as Twitter does, if people are cut off from access to those because of their political or religious views, this is a form of totalitarianism.
When we consider threats to religious freedom, we usually think of an overreaching state that strips away rights or crushes opposition. More concerning, perhaps, is the rise of corporations like Amazon, which you've just referred to, and woke capitalism in general. What, in your view, is the way that the state will work in tandem with powerful corporations to control our cultural direction?
Well, that's the whole idea of corporations being the enemy of liberty is something relatively new in America, or at least on the American right. I'm 54 years old. I came of age politically under Ronald Reagan, and back then, conservatives in the U.S. thought that the enemy was the state, and corporations were at worst neutral, but at best they were avatars of liberty and freedom and commerce and so forth. That all changed in the last decade or two. Now in the US, major corporations are very woke. It's not just Amazon, it's Coca-Cola, for example, one of the world's biggest corporations. It was reported just the other day here in the US that Coca-Cola has been doing internal diversity training where they are requiring people to affirm that being white is bad, that whiteness is something bad. And this is just insane. And I hope that they get sued over this, but this is quite common. The stereotype that corporations are run by conservatives who only care about the bottom line is completely false. How will the government, the state, work with corporations? Well, last year it was reported that one of the federal law enforcement agencies here in the US, I forget which one, maybe the Drug Enforcement Administration, it bought data that it was available on the free market that had been captured by one of the big corporations, Google or one of them, and used it to make arrests. What happens, and a lot of people don't realize this, what happens whenever you use the internet or use your smartphone, use apps on there, it generates a cloud of data that corporations harvest for their own use. It may be completely meaningless to you, but if they put enough points of this data together, meaning the places you've been through your GPS, the websites you've been to, the friends you have on social media, companies can eventually figure out enough about you to tailor their advertising to you. Well, if that data happened to be acquired by the government, from whether it's law enforcement or somebody else, then they can use that against you. They can use that to figure out who you are, where you go, and who you associate with. In China, there's no separation. There's no wall between corporations and the state. Here in the US, and I'm sure in Australia too, there is a wall, but that wall is becoming more and more porous all the time. I spoke recently to a retired military intelligence officer here in the US who also is a Christian. And he had read my book, Live Not by Lies, and he said, listen, I want to reaffirm that the things you say in there really are true, that we really can in the US, the government really does capture all electronic communication and stores it in these massive servers out in the Utah desert. I mean, this isn't a secret. Couldn't tell me if it was a secret, but I mean, it's been widely reported. And he said what they're doing is they're storing all this for future mining. If they develop powerful enough algorithms, they'll be able to mine this to find any information that you put out there and to use against you. So it's not just a matter of corporations getting it, but also the state's getting it. And if the state needs to get this information from corporations because it wants to do some kind of criminal investigation, it will be able to do so.
One of your more frightening predictions is around that harvesting of data by big tech companies that could be used by the government. You worry that analyzed data could even be used to stop someone from becoming a dissident before they even could know themselves. How is this possible?
Well, one of the tools that they have, and this is just mind-blowing, it seems like science fiction, but it's actually happening now. There's a company in Silicon Valley that has used artificial intelligence to create a way to read someone's faces and know their emotions. So for example, there's a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff that I draw this from. If they put this software in smart TVs, for example, or in computers, it can read your face and it knows what you're watching and report this back to what your inner thoughts are, or reasonable guesses to your inner thoughts. It reports this back to the company, and this is all so it can figure out how to sell you things better. Well, it doesn't, you don't have to be a genius to know how this sort of thing can be used against dissidents. In China now, I saw just the other day a report about how they're using the same technology in classrooms. Where they monitor the faces of students, and they can know if the student, or they can reasonably guess using artificial intelligence and facial recognition software, if the student is sick. Maybe the student doesn't know it himself. They can know when you're coming down with an illness, and they can know what makes you happy, what makes you sad, what makes you anxious, and so on and so forth. And this is a way of weeding out who the troublemakers are. And it's really incredible that the way technology is getting it to a point where it doesn't actually invade our brains in a literal way, but it may as well, because they're so good at analyzing the connection between facial expressions and habits, and being able to predict what we do. Again, this came from capitalism, from companies trying to figure out how to sell us things better, but it has obvious political uses for government.
You refer to the Chinese government's use of the word harmonization, which is a euphemism for the neutralizing of seditious conduct. The most extreme example of this would be the treatment of the million Uyghur people held in Chinese camps today. Do you see similar things coming for Western countries?
It's hard for me to see something as extreme as that coming, Rowan, but maybe it's because I lack imagination. I think rather that it will be easier to get most people in the West to conform by simply taking away our jobs, our livelihoods, making us into outcasts. Everybody wants to be successful. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be successful, but so far, most of us have never had, in the West, have never had to make the sort of choice between middle class success, a peaceful life, a comfortable life, and our principles. Well, I think those days are over now. And I think that the sort of repression that's happening in Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs is an outlier, but I think that eventually the sort of thing may be tried here if the normal social credit system doesn't get the results that they want to see. And again, when I hesitate to make these sort of predictions, because here in the US, when you talk about the possibility of a social credit system coming here, a lot of people think you're crazy. But the people I talk to for my book, Live Not by Lies, the people who were born under communism, they see this happening all the time, and they get really angry because Americans are so immersed in our idea that we're a special country and this sort of thing can't happen here. It can happen here, and it is happening here. You know, since January 6th, that's the day that the U.S. Capitol was attacked, we're seeing more and more people in the media and among the activist community refer to people who voted for Trump or who supported Trump as domestic terrorists. Now, I remember 9/11. I was working in New York as a journalist on 9/11. I saw the first tower come down with my own eyes. And I remember the sense of panic that was constant in the country then. I mean, we're panicked for a good reason. We didn't know what was coming next in terms of terrorism. But the government at the time used the people's natural fear to manipulate us, I believe, into supporting certain government initiatives, most of all the Iraq War. And I can remember back then being so angry at Muslims for what happened on 9/11, for the attacks on 9/11, that when I heard some civil liberties lawyers and others saying, hey, wait a minute, the FBI, the government is going too far in monitoring mosques and things like that, I didn't care, because I thought Muslims were that much of a threat to this country. Well, I regret that very much. I live to regret that, and I live to regret my complete support for the Iraq War. But I'm thinking about this now, that in the wake of January 6th, how the same kind of demonization of religious people and people for politics is arising now in our media and elsewhere, saying that, oh, they're terrorists if they don't agree with, if they supported Trump. Even the 70 million people supported Trump, and they can't all be the sort of people who would invade the Capitol. But it seems to me that we're seeing the manufacture happen right now, the manufacture of consent for actions to be taken, boycotts, cancelization, and other things against people who simply happen to be on the right. The consent for their marginalization and persecution is already being manufactured. And just this week, some activist group announced a plan to gather as many names as possible of people that they can prove voted for Donald Trump, and to publicize this on the internet so nobody will hire them, nobody will do business with them, and nobody will want to have anything to do with them. I mean, that is obviously totalitarian, but that's where the mindset is here. It's just getting really out of control.
You make it clear that your concerns are not partisan, but more derived from history and an understanding of ideology. What are some of the ways that your thesis goes beyond left and right-wing categories?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't, right now I'm thinking that it's going to be focus on the right and on Christians in particular. And that's I've written the book for that, but it doesn't have to be just them. Since my book came out, I've become friends with someone named Bari Weiss, who is she's a center-left journalist. She is an open lesbian, a Jewish lesbian, and she said to me that she never thought that she would end up being friends and allies with Rod Dreher, but here she is. And the reason is Bari Weiss is an old-fashioned liberal. She worked at the New York Times, had a great job at the New York Times, but she quit that job at the New York Times because she was sick of how the cancel culture mob, the woke mob within the Times, was bullying and successfully bullying the management at the Times to shut down any discourse and anything in the paper that didn't meet their very narrow progressive definitions of the kind of speech they would allow. Similarly, at Evergreen State University here in the US, in Washington State, 3 years ago, a professor named Brett Weinstein, he and his wife are both atheists and very much on the left, but they were driven out of the university because they objected to an initiative that the students were pushing to have all white people leave the university for one day. They said, this is racist, we're not going to do it. They were driven out. The campus police said, we can't protect you. Well, they've joined the movement too, even though we have no religious beliefs in common. Our politics are diametrically opposed, but we all agree on the importance of the classical liberal principle of free speech and free assembly and tolerance. This is how you're seeing these amazing alliances arise here in the US right now between old-fashioned free speech liberals and conservatives like me. In fact, when I was, and this is in my book, Live Not by Lies, when I was in the Czech Republic interviewing dissidents there, they told me that back in the day, under communism, you couldn't afford to not be friends with somebody and not be allies with somebody who had the courage to resist the government, because it was so rare. So this is how you had people like the Catholics, Václav Benda and his wife Camilla, allying with a Trotskyist in Prague named Peter Uhl. They were completely diametrically opposed on everything, but they all agreed that the government, this totalitarian government, is evil, and we have to stand together to fight it. This is one thing I hope that we'll start seeing more and more from the left, the old-fashioned liberals, those who believe in free speech, even if it's something they don't agree with, that they'll realize that they're going to be canceled too, because the Puritans and the woke movement, the social justice warriors, they're happy to come after people on their own side who don't conform.
Several statistics in your book reveal that younger generations are increasingly intolerant of dissent from woke views. You refer to this as preferencing a false peace of conformity rather than the tensions of liberty. How can people be persuaded that living with this tension is a better way?
That is such a key question, Rowan, because the chapter in my book that I think is the most important is a book about suffering. And people in the Eastern Bloc are saying that Americans and young people in their own countries today are so vulnerable to totalitarian manipulation because everyone is so afraid to suffer. I tell a story in that chapter about being in Budapest in Hungary, traveling through the city on a tram with a young woman who was my translator. She was at the time, I think, 29 years old, married 5 years, had one young child, one on the way. She was telling me that she has difficulty as a Catholic talking to her other friends there, even her Catholic friends of her generation, about the struggles she has as a young wife and as a mom. She said as soon as she starts talking about her struggles, they immediately say, leave your husband, put your son in daycare, go back to work. You've got to be happy. She said, I tell them, I am happy. It's normal to have anxiety and struggles within a marriage and raising a kid. But I just need help in figuring out how to deal with it. She said, they don't understand it at all. Well, I think, Rowan, the reason I bring that up is that is relevant to your question about trying to persuade young people that it's better to live with those tensions. If suffering is seen by the young as true in the US and true in Hungary as something that is to be avoided at all costs, and something as mild as anxiety over a marriage or anxiety over raising a child is considered intolerable, then people will accept anything in order to get rid of that anxiety because they believe that they're entitled to an anxiety-free life. This is why you see so many young people on campuses and within workplaces, like at the New York Times, screaming bloody murder that they feel unsafe there because someone has expressed an opinion different to what they find congenial. I think that we have to go to Aldous Huxley's book, The Brave New World, where in chapter 17 of that book, that dystopian book about a different kind of totalitarianism, chapter 17, he has his dissident hero, John the Savage, meeting with the world controller, Mustafa Mond. And unlike in 1984, when Winston Smith, the protagonist of Orwell's novel, meets with the torturer O'Brien, Mustafa Mond doesn't try to torture John the Savage. He looks at him and says, why don't you want to join our society? We give you everything you want. You never have to be anxious about anything. You never have to suffer for anything. And John the Savage looks at him and says, I'm fighting for the right to be unhappy, because you can't have a fully human life if you don't have the possibility of suffering, if you don't have something to struggle against. To be a human being is to suffer and to overcome that suffering and to learn how to live with it and learn to be more loving and compassionate as we share the human condition. I think that if you go to young people and say you have to learn how to suffer, they're not going to understand that. But if you introduce them to film and literature that presents suffering and imperfection and learning to live with imperfection as part of the human condition and as something out of which love and compassion and strength grow, then maybe they can be persuaded to back off. But I think right now we've done this to ourselves by raising children, to being helicopter parents, by making them think that if anything is wrong, that they have a right to freak out. I think that we have dug the grave of liberalism by doing that. I think in the U.S., Ron, one of the most important events happened in terms of this whole unfolding scenario of wokeness and soft totalitarianism happened in the year 2015, in October 2015 at Yale University. There was a message went out from the university administration to the students, warning them to be careful about which Halloween costumes you wear. You don't want to offend somebody. You don't want to be guilty of cultural appropriation and so forth. Well, in one of the residential colleges there, Erica Christakis, a professor who she and her husband Nicholas were sort of like house parents there, Erica sent out something to the students saying, really, is this the business of a university to tell adults, legal adults, what they can and can't wear on Halloween? Isn't this ridiculous? It blew up in her face. The students got so angry. They accused her of not caring about them. They went crazy. They demanded her resignation and so on and so forth. You can go on YouTube and see a conflict that her husband, Nicholas Christakis, also a professor at Yale, had on the square, on the quad there at Yale with a group of students. And he was trying to engage them in a Socratic dialogue or just an exchange of ideas about, well, what does it mean? What are you protesting? Help me understand, listen to what I'm saying, just something that was completely normal in past years. If you go and look at it, this mob of young people are screaming at him. They are in such emotional distress. They're cursing him. They're, sobbing. It's freaky. They're out of control of their emotions, and they want some authority to come in and smash the Christakises because the Christakises have disturbed their sense of peace. If you look at that online on YouTube, October 2015 at Yale, you see the seeds right there of totalitarianism. Because what's going to happen is this whole generation, especially as they're moving into positions of power in institutions, and certainly Yale University, Princeton, these other elite Ivy League schools in the US, they're producing the next generation of American elite leadership. When you see them having no problem at all exercising authority to smash dissent in the name of protecting their sense of well-being and what they consider to be their right to have no anxiety and no suffering, it's really, really troubling.
An illustration of Soviet Union suffering you reference is Václav Havel's greengrocer, a man that stops play acting in his obedience to the state and suffers greatly for it. In our time, how is it that we can train ourselves to embrace suffering willingly? And what is the necessary character or mindset one must have to be prepared for it?
Oh, what a good question. People may not know the story of Havel's greengrocer, so I'll tell it briefly because it makes a very important point. Václav Havel, the leader of the Czech opposition and once imprisoned playwright, wrote a fable of the greengrocer to try to explain why people should be willing to suffer to resist communism. He said, imagine that you're a grocer in town and all businesses in the city have to hang in their shop window the sign saying, "Workers of the world unite," the communist slogan. Nobody believes it, but everybody hangs it there just to avoid trouble. Well, what happens if a little greengrocer in town one day decides, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to hang the sign. Well, what happens? The state comes, they arrest him as a traitor or on some political charge. They take his business. He is suddenly forced to go be a janitor or something like that. His kids can't go to the best colleges and so on and so forth. He suffers, pays a real price for his convictions. But what has he done by paying that price publicly? He has shown that it is possible, if you have courage and are willing to suffer, it is possible to live in truth, to live faithfully to your convictions. And if enough people do that, they undermine the totalitarian system. Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet dissident, he made the same point in a 1974 missive to his followers in Russia just before the Soviets exiled him in 1974. He told them that to live not by lies. That's where I got the title of the book. And he told them the same thing, that just we can't overturn this government, but if you simply refuse to go along with the lies that we all have to nod our heads to get along in this society, if you stop doing that, then maybe things will turn around. You will at least have your integrity, but you have to be willing to suffer the consequences. It's so hard here in America to talk about this sort of thing with fellow Christians because it just doesn't make sense. Everything about the cultural liturgy in America, and I'm not just talking about within the church, but in daily life, is all about comfort and convenience. We think we produce this generation of snowflake kids who are not able to withstand even inconvenience without melting down. But they didn't come from nowhere. I think that we ourselves have to start, first of all, reading the stories of these people, these dissidents under communism, the underground churches there, the underground church in China, their stories, and also become aware by reading Christian history about how common it was to be persecuted for your faith and learn how they did it. I think we also need to just switch our imagination, if that makes sense. We need to start imagining that, yes, this could happen here, and what would we do if? We need to start preparing ourselves to think about what we could do without, what we would be willing to do without for the sake of being true to our faith convictions. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and we have a pretty serious fasting tradition in our church. During Lent, faithful Orthodox Christians give up meat and dairy for the whole 40 days of Lent. It's tough, but it trains you to understand that there are times when you do have to suffer certain deprivation, not for the sake of harming yourself, but for the sake of building up your spiritual muscles, to realize that there are times when you have to say no, because man does not live by bread alone. I think that we ourselves in the Christian churches, and not just within the churches, but within societies, if we know that we think it likely we're going to be persecuted, we need to start learning to deny ourselves and to get ourselves in a position where we won't have to make the decision, in a short period of time. Like, to be concrete there, Rowan, if we find out one day that we've got to do something like fly the rainbow flag from our desk, or we'll be fired, well, if you only have a day or two to make that decision, you're not going to have time to really think it through, and you're likely to do the thing that's going to be easiest. But if you've thought about it, where you're going to draw the line personally in your professional life, into how far you will be able to go and still live a life of integrity and live within truth, then when that line is crossed, you will already have done the deep thinking and praying and collaboration with your spouse and with others about how you will support yourself if you have to say no. When I was in Poland researching this book, I met with some Polish Catholics who worked for Western multinational corporations, which tend to be the best jobs in Poland. And these are all conservative people, Catholics, and they were being compelled to live like American workers and celebrate LGBT pride. And they said that they didn't have any particular objection to LGBT pride going on in their corporations, but they themselves did not want to participate in it because it violated their consciences. They were afraid that the day was coming very fast when they would have to decide between their jobs or their faith, being true to their faith. And I told them that, your government ought to be trying to protect you and keep that from happening. But if the government is not going to do that, then you need to start putting a network in place to have a plan B, an escape plan. So there's something else you can go do, so you don't deny your faith in the office. I mean, there's so many different ways this can come at us, Rowan. But the main point is that we need to understand that suffering is an integral part, not only of life, but of the Christian life. And that if we are afraid to suffer at all, then we may as well give up right then, because our faith is only valid when we can live in comfort. There's a Kierkegaard said, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said that there are two kinds of people: admirers of Christ and disciples of Christ. And you don't know who is the disciple and who is the admirer until suffering comes. And we are called to be disciples of Christ. So I would have people, and I would suggest to your listeners and to everyone who is in a church, to think what it means to be a disciple, not an admirer, and to think concretely what it is, because the decision is going to come to all of us one day. Are we disciples or are we admirers?
Many people in Christian churches of a conservative stripe consider that they've been inoculated from lies and big lies foisted upon them. What are some of the more subtle ways that you think even these conservative churches are giving in to lies?
Well, here in the U.S., a lot of conservative churches were so engaged in politics, and particularly in the Donald Trump campaign. And I don't want to talk about politics, positive or negative here, but I would just say that they really thought, a lot of conservative Christians really thought, that if we just got the right politicians in office and the right judges on the bench, that everything was going to be taken care of. That has been, frankly, the strategy for a lot of conservative churches for the last 30, 40 years. And it has been a complete failure. If you look at the statistics here in the US, the number of Christians started to fall away and starting around 1991, 92. And while our leaders, our pastors and other leaders have been so busy trying to shore up activism and getting behind the right candidate, they have neglected the way the culture itself has transformed their kids. Right now, the so-called Generation Z, those born after 1997, are going to be the first generation in American history in which a majority of them are not Christian. And that's not just because we've had more immigration from non-Christian countries. It's because most of these young people who come from Christian homes are leaving the faith. The Trump years, for better or for worse, have definitely seen an increase in young people leaving the church because they see their parents as hypocritical. Their parents were strongly critical of President Bill Clinton for his immoral behavior, but they gave Trump a pass. Again, don't want to take a stand on Trump in this conversation, but I just want to point out that Christians thinking that politics is the be all and end all, that if we just get the right people in power, we're going to be fine. That is a huge lie. And it's something that is really, I think one reason my book is selling so well here in the US is it came out just at the end of the political campaign, the presidential campaign last fall. And when Trump lost, the scales fell from the eyes of a lot of Christians. I was telling them years ago, like, don't put your trust in princes, but a lot of Christians just didn't want to accept the fact that that electing Donald Trump was not going to be the shield that we needed to protect ourselves. Well, that shield has gone, and now people are really frightened by what's coming, and they should be frightened. I mean, frightened only in a positive sense, in the sense of, let's not sit here and just huddle under the table. Let's get out and start building these networks that we need to be the resistance. I think another lie that Christians tell themselves, and this is huge, middle-class people tell themselves that, if we let our kids have smartphones and open access to the internet, it's going to be fine. We can control that. It's just not true. I mean, it's a weird lie because it seems completely implausible on the surface, but parents are having so much trouble telling their kids no to smartphones and to all this technology that is being used to dramatically undermine their own authority and their kids' faith. and is being used to break down a lot of barriers within kids, psychological and cultural barriers to things like transgenderism. We know this is true, but parents somehow seem to think that the problem is out there and it's not going to affect them and their family and their house. Some parents are having to learn the hard way that that's not the case. Frankly, all the accoutrements and practices of ordinary middle-class life in a place like the United States, which includes having an Alexa in your house, the smart speaker, having smartphones, having your kids wired into that. These are all things that are going to are hurting us badly now and will hurt us badly in the future. Christians need to understand that we can't live like everybody else and still be faithful to Christ, that we're going to have to make a decision sooner or later about where our true treasure lies. And if Christians tell themselves that they can be successful in business or in their professions without having to pay a price going forward, I think that's a big lie. Right now, I'm having Christian doctors telling me that they don't want their kids to go into medicine because they can see what's happening within medicine, that their children are going to have to, if they become doctors, are going to be compelled to perform abortions or to participate in transgender surgeries against their consciences, or be forced to surrender their medical license. That's not the case yet, but it's coming. Right now in the US, we have something called the Equality Act that just passed the House of Representatives. Biden wants to sign it. If the Senate passes it, I don't know how likely that is to happen, but if it happens, then LGBT will be written into American civil rights law, and it will be impossible for any physician not to give transgender treatment like hormones and things like that and surgery to someone wanting them. There will be no conscience clause for them because it will be seen as civil rights, as a civil rights law. So this is what I mean when I say that Christians have to stop lying to themselves and thinking that they'll be able to continue living a normal middle-class professional life and still practice their faith without any problems. This is increasingly going to become a point of contention, and also within corporations too. I mean, it's amazing how fast this has happened here in the US, wokeness, the rise of wokeness in corporations. It used to be the case that corporations didn't really care. They didn't want to get involved in the culture war and cultural politics. They just wanted to make money. But around 2010 and thereabouts, corporations began to change and began to embrace progressive political and social causes as part of building their brand. In the year 2015, here in the US, the state of Indiana, a conservative Midwestern state, passed a law, a state version of the federal law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that would have only given religious people an affirmative defense in court if they were sued for discrimination. It wouldn't have guaranteed that they would win, but it would at least give them some greater legal standing than they would have before. Well, when that happened, Governor Mike Pence, evangelical Christian, signed it into law. Suddenly, major corporations like Apple Computers, Salesforce, and other big corporate names came down like a ton of bricks on the state of Indiana. They said, this is bigoted legislation. If you don't repeal it, there will be severe economic consequences. Well, the state was forced to repeal it, and the law has not come up anywhere else since then. This is important, Rowan, because this was the first time in U.S. history that big business had taken sides in the culture war, and they took sides decisively. This was the Waterloo of social conservatism in America. And I'm quite sure you're having the same thing happening in Australia.
You referred to the extraordinary scenes we saw in Washington, D.C. last month, where protests there spilled into Congress. This was attributed in part to widespread acceptance of conspiracy theories like QAnon among right-wing groups. Is the damage caused by these right-wing movements on par with the damage of left-wing ideologies you warn about in your book?
No, I don't, but I don't want to diminish the right-wing ideology because It is important. This is something that emerged to my thinking, or in my thinking, after I finished the manuscript for Live Not by Lies, the QAnon phenomenon. Uh, in Live Not by Lies, I talk about how Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century political theorist, she wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, in which she looked at the factors, the social factors in Germany and in Russia that allowed those countries to fall to totalitarianism. And one of the things she saw was that before totalitarianism took hold in both countries, one of the things that they did was people started believing things that weren't true, and they had every reason to believe they weren't true, but they didn't care that they weren't true. They believed in ideological claims that suited their preferences. Now, in Live Not by Lies, I talk about how this is happening all the time on the left, but we weren't seeing a lot of it on the right. Well, with QAnon, we absolutely were, and some of the Trump conspiracy theories. It's no better when it happens on the right than on the left, in part because, as long as conservatives chase after conspiracy theories, we're not dealing with the real world, and we're not going to be prepared to fight for our own liberties in the real world if we're just chasing phantoms. But I think it's far, far more important that that conspiracy theory thinking and this ideological thinking is happening on the left, because the left controls American institutions. There's a prominent left-wing critic of progressives, a man named John McWhorter. He's a black man, a professor of linguistics at Columbia University in New York. He has a piece up online now on his Substack newsletter where he's making the same point that I've been making for a while, but he can do it with particular authority because he's a black man and a liberal. And it's what he's doing is saying that it matters so much more that the left is giving themselves over to these things, because the left controls media, the left controls academia, the left increasingly controls corporations and every other major institution in American society. And they're the one, because they control them, they're the ones who control discourse. The left controls Amazon. You're not going to see Amazon canceling books or refusing to sell books by left-wing authors. One of my favorite writers, Abigail Shrier, she's written a book about transgenderism. She pointed out that Amazon just today is still selling a book in which about transgenderism that talks favorably about children performing sexual acts. I mean, it's horrible. Amazon's not going to cancel that because the elites on the left have marched through these institutions. Social change happens because elites first come to believe in it and share these same beliefs through their networks. This is how the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia. It wasn't initially a revolution of the masses. The communists first had to convince the people who controlled the institutions in Tsarist Russia to give them a chance, and then that gave them a foothold, and eventually they took over the whole country. In a similar way, when left-wing elites on university campuses, in newsrooms and elsewhere come to believe these crazy things, that is much, much more important. Just this week, some data were released by a think tank in America. They did a survey asking how many unarmed black men or black people were shot and killed in 2019 in America. And they asked people to make a guess, and they identified the guesses people made by whether they were on the left, the far left, the right, the far right, the center, whatever. Everybody guessed too many. The correct answer is between 13 and 27, depending on who's doing the counting. People on the far left said that 10,000 or more than 10,000. People on the right were closer, but still overestimated it. This is because of the way the media report on the issue of race and crime and police shootings. I got it wrong too. I guessed 100 or more because there's so much constant reporting on it. You would think it was happening all the time. Similarly, the Gallup poll, respected poll in America, has done polls for years asking Americans to estimate the percentage of Americans who are LGBT. And it's so funny. The correct answer is something like between 3 and 6%. But Americans, the average American says it's 24%. Well, that's ridiculous. But you can understand why they would get it, because people who believe in advocating constantly in gender ideology and LGBT rights, They control the cultural high ground in entertainment, in news media, and in the academy. So they create the atmosphere in which people understand the society they're in. This is why it matters so much more that the left believe extreme and ridiculous things than those on the right do.
You referred there to the control of the academy and the institutions. What insight can you offer perplexed Christians as to why their beliefs have become so unpopular in only the last 5 or 10 years?
Great question. It used to be in the US that neither political party, Republican or Democrat, had a monopoly on religious believers. That began to change in the 90s. I read some academic research showing that as the Republican Party became the party of the religious right, the Democratic Party became the party of the secular left in the same way. In other words, as people who voted on religious and cultural causes, they moved over to the Republican side, and more secular Republicans became Democrats. I think a lot of it has to do, Rowan, with the way people in American life, and I guess in modern life, have become siloed within echo chambers. They only hang out with people they already agree with. A lot of the professions, say the academy, certainly in media, have become ideologically monocultures, and ideological monocultures where you just don't find Christians or conservatives. They are not friendly to these places. If you are going to be an open Christian and not a progressive Christian, you're going to have to be prepared to be disliked and even discriminated against in these fields. And I think a lot of Christians imagine themselves to be decent people, and they are decent people, that they get along with everybody. They can't imagine until it happens to them that they are considered by a lot of people on the left and in these leftist dominated workspaces and spaces, they're considered to be not just wrong, but evil. When I was at the Dallas Morning News, I was a columnist there between 2003 and 2009. Dallas, mind you, is one of probably the most conservative big city in the US. Maybe Houston would be as conservative and maybe more conservative. But anyway, I was a conservative columnist there. There were people in that newspaper who would turn away from me in the hallway and face the wall when I would walk by because they hated me for writing columns against gay marriage or defending the traditional family. Now, I would write these columns very ironically. I would try to use reason and respect and tolerance and all that. It didn't matter. They thought I was not just wrong, but evil, and they could not even be seen to meet my gaze. It sounds crazy, but this is the mindset inside so many elite institutions. And I think as they have become more monocultural, they have become more fanatical. I mentioned earlier in our talk about how a friend of mine who've known me for 4 decades cut me off because even though I was critical of President Trump, I didn't hate him. Well, I think that the Trump years, the past 4 years, has made people on the left even more radical that way. Whereas before they would have seen us as badly misguided, they now see us as an existential threat. Just before I came on with you, I saw some new polling showing that among Democratic voters, the thing they consider to be the greatest threat to the United States of America is Trump voters. 52% of them see Trump voters as a greater threat to the US than China or racism or any other problem, any other challenge. That is incredible. But this is the environment we now live in. And I just would tell. Well, let me say this too. When I was doing the Benedict Option book tour, I went to an evangelical college in the Midwest here in America, conservative evangelical college, and I gave a lecture about the importance of spiritual disciplines in creating a strong, robust Christian character within ourselves and within our institutions. And a young woman in the Q&A period stood up, a student, and said, "Sir, I don't understand why you keep bringing up Christian disciplines. What does that have to do with anything? Why isn't it enough just to love Jesus with all our heart, soul, and mind like our parents taught us?" And I said to her, well, you have to start with loving Jesus in that way, but that love has to be instantiated in concrete practices. So we learn how to be strong even when we're challenged in our faith. A professor came up to me after that answer, after the Q&A, and said, "Rod, what you've just said doesn't make sense to these kids. Most of them see things just as that young woman did, because these kids are all product of church youth group culture. Church youth group culture teaches kids that to be a Christian is relational, is getting along with everybody. Jesus is your buddy. And it works when you're in a society where people don't hate you for being Christian. But these kids come here, and they come here to this college, and it's still a Christian bubble, but they get out into the world, and suddenly people hate them because they're Christian. They think they're evil. And the kids are not ready for that, and so they collapse. They end up thinking that the traditional Christianity their parents have taught them, the biblical Christianity, is mean. And so they embrace progressivism because they want to get along with others. This is part of the problem. Christians just don't realize what it is to be hated in the world today for being Christian. One last thing, last fall I was out giving a talk about Live Not by Lies in Nashville, and I met a pastor of a megachurch, evangelical megachurch from Portland, Oregon, which is one of the most progressive cities in the U.S. It had a lot of Antifa protests there and fires and things like that. And we met in the green room at the conference, and he said, "Rod, I have to tell you that when Benedict Option came out in 2017, everybody around me said, Dreher is being too alarmist. Things aren't really like that. Yeah, we live in a progressive, very secular city, but people don't treat us like we're the enemy." He said, in just 3 years, everything has completely changed. And now we realize in Portland that we have to live the Benedict option. We have to live not by lies, because that's the only way that we can maintain our Christian witness and our Christian integrity, because things have turned so quickly from being, yeah, they tolerate us, to they actively hate us. And the pastor said, what's happening in Portland and on the West Coast is going to come to the rest of America sooner or later.
An Orwell quote from your book says, "It's less important to win arguments than it is to keep yourself grounded in reality." How should his advice specifically guide our approach to promoting and protecting religious freedom in the coming decades?
Well, we have to keep the spaces, the churches, the religious schools open, places where young people and everybody can be presented with what we know to be true from the Bible. Because what they will be hearing out in the public square, in public schools, places like that, will be increasingly insane from a Christian point of view. I spoke this past week with a group of senior leaders from a conservative denomination here in the U.S. We had a private Zoom conference, and one of them said that in their church, he pastors a big church. He said that whenever we presented the church's teaching on sex and gender, we had a large group of kids stand up and walk out of our own church, kids who had been raised in the church. We found out why, because they had been taught in school that gender ideology is true, and if you hear anybody deny it, you stand up and walk out because they're bigots. Well, we have to be prepared for that sort of thing, because these kids didn't want to hear the church teach them this, but that's their choice. But we have to at least try to keep the faithful Christian schools and churches open, make sure we have the freedom, the right to be wrong, so to speak. We don't think we're wrong, but we need to have the freedom to operate. And that is something that we have been fighting for. We should have been fighting for a while ago. I remember back in the early 2000s, when the gay marriage issue was heating up here in the US, I came to a certain point where I realized we've lost this battle. We in the church, we conservatives in the church, have lost this battle. And the thing we need to focus all our political capital on now, our diminishing political capital, is religious freedom. That is, erecting legal boundaries around church schools, church facilities like Christian hospitals and Christian churches, within which we can practice our faith and proclaim our teaching, not only proclaim the teaching, but live out our faith without being assaulted by the government. Well, a lot of Christians didn't believe that then. They didn't think it would get as bad as it is. And now we find ourselves in a situation where just the term religious liberty in the US used to be a non-controversial term. Well, now the left portrays it as being code words for bigotry, for anti-gay hatred. And so it's going to be very, very hard to keep our religious liberties in this media environment and in this cultural environment. But we have to do it, because if we get to the place where they can shut down our churches, our schools, and so forth, where will we be? We'll be driven underground.
The book is Live Not by Lies, and I encourage everyone to read this very important work. Rod, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today on Talking Freely.
It's been great, Rowan, and I want to encourage the church in Australia. We're all in this together. One thing that I learned from interviewing people, dissidents in the former Soviet bloc, is that they realized when they were in prison, whether they came from a Protestant church, a Catholic church, or an Orthodox church, they weren't in prison because they were Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. They were in prison because they confessed Jesus Christ, and they needed to stand with each other, both outside the prison walls and within the prison. So I encourage all your listeners to stand with the believers in whatever church they are and in whatever country they are, because if we don't stand together, then we're going to fall separately.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.